Whether you're conquering professional exams or personal milestones, we welcome you to Beyond Clean's Confidence Certification, the 52-week test prep podcast series. With expert insights, actionable tips, and engaging discussions, we'll break down the toughest concepts in sterile processing and build your confidence every step of the way. Join host Sarah B. Cruz as she embarks on a mission to help you not just prep for tests, but craft your success story. And now your host, Sarah B. Cruz.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Confidence Certification, a 52-week test prep podcast series to equip you to take your sterile processing career to the next level. I'm your host, Sarah B. Cruz, and on this episode, we're going to actually be talking about the power of literature and why the book matters to how we achieve our certification and how we study. So I know that when we talk about getting ready for our certification test and listening to this podcast, there's a lot of practical skill in it. I mean, and every episode has a mid-session confidence boost where I talk about a key concept that, is discussed in the literature. It doesn't mean that it's on your certification test. I don't know what's on your certification test. I'm not privy to that information. But it's important to me as a podcaster that you understand that this information is supplemental to your studying. I do not encourage anyone to just use this podcast as a way to study for your certification tests. Those little breaks in between the episodes, really, they're important. And if they resonate with how you're learning and you want to take notes and it's really helping inspire you and keep you motivated, please write them down. And let them be guidance for where you may need to focus more in the book. And before I get too excited, let me tell you all that Bobby Parker is hanging out with us again today. Hey, Bobby.
Hey, everybody. How you, Sarah? Thanks for having me back. The book matters. What a novel idea.
Ha, but he'll be here all day, folks.
That's right.
Yeah. And so and again, another reason why Bobby and I resonate and why we really jive is because we are both big book nerds, dare I say. So it's important that we take away the point that this is supplemental learning. Anything you do outside of the book is supposed to help you study the contents you're learning from the book. Wherever you're getting your certification from, I can't encourage you more to own that manual. What do you think, Bobby?
Preach it, sister. I love what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole host of reasons we're going to get into why studying the book matters, but let's bring it all the way down to its core. It's because we're in this field not for the glory, not for the accolades, not for the money. We're in it for the patients, right? We're in it because we're passionate about it. And the book is the most comprehensive resource that you're going to have in preparing for this certification and doing your skills well at your job. And so let's be about the book. Let's absorb all of it and try to avoid those shortcuts that maybe seem like an easy way to get some letters behind her name, right?
Yeah, definitely. Because even though all the letters look great and they feel good, that's not what it's about, right? We talked a lot about extrinsic motivators, and maybe in the past you did it for health insurance. Maybe you did it to get that pay increase if your facility offered you that. But as soon as you get those short-term goals, those letters are still with you. You're still expected to be the technician that achieved those and understand and demonstrate the knowledge necessary to have achieved those. Right, Bobby?
That's exactly right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So when we use these supplemental resources as our primary form of studying, we're doing a really big disservice to ourselves and the patient and our professional presentation. I think it's important, especially when you're looking online for a lot of free resources, you really vet the information that you're getting. And I'm not throwing any tea or shade. Like, listen, don't get me wrong. I've taken an online practice quiz or two in my day just to figure out that I don't know anything about decon. Okay. So immediately failing straight out the rip. Yeah. But a lot of the times it is based on outdated or inaccurate information. So for example, A lot of these practice quizzes are made with the best interests of sterile processing professionals studying for their own test, right? So you're counting on their own integrity, their own comprehension, and then how they're relaying that information to make that practice test. So if you're learning about the difference between the different air cycles like dynamic air removal and gravity displacement, and they mix the two up when they're making their practice test, you may be taking that as the word, the final say, because you don't have that reference to go back to. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, and they live out there forever. So to your point, who is maintaining and updating these resources that were made 8 years ago? We just went through another update to the certification manual, and that may not have the newest information in it. And so, yeah, it could be valuable to lean on those resources as a way of comprehending or a way of assessing whether or not you've comprehended the material that you studied. But just going to those resources as the source of truth to study, that's a recipe for disaster. And it's not only the quizzes, really. Anything other than the source material that you're going to find online, even something like social media, like Facebook or YouTube or TikTok, you have to be careful with that. Now, I believe there's a lot of value in being engaged in social media for the sterile processing industry. I work at Beyond Clean. Yeah, we're making a certification confidence podcast right now. So obviously we see the value in doing these things, but even in listening to the confidence boost sections in the middle of these podcasts, even in getting CEs through Beyond Clean or going to the Facebook sterile processing page of your choice, all of those things ought to be judged by the standards that support what's being said. And so, yeah, we want to be a people of the book and not just relying on the various online free resources that are out there.
Right, because anyone can make a video. Right. And I don't like to think that anyone in our space would put out bad information. And that's why I don't like to use the term bad or good. You know, it's just whether or not it's effective, accurate, applicable. You know, there's a ton of videos about tabletop sterilizers on YouTube that were made in the 80s. Because that's when they actually tested about tabletop sterilizers. You know, in different spaces, you don't even teach that. In my curriculum at my local community college for certification tests, I don't even teach it because it's not recommended because it's not on that test. Then you have the presence of different types of technology that wanes and ebbs and flows through our industry, right? Like ethylene oxide. I used that all the time when I was in veterinary medicine. I don't use it at all in my facility anymore. That's not saying it's not out there, but it's taking all of that relevance into consideration, right?
Absolutely. So with all that considered, then, are there any good resources out there that should supplement your certification studying? I think so. And a good place to start is that workbook that comes with the course. You know the one I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially when, okay, the hard thing with the workbook, though, is not looking at the answers while you're taking the test. Do the whole test first before you look at the answers at the end of the book. So while the workbook is an effective tool, maybe you could speak a little bit about how to use it effectively, because I'm a cheater. I'll look at all the answers. So
that's funny. So the reason that I say it is not because we're trying to sell more workbooks or I think that there's unlimited value in having the workbook. The reason I say it is because it does a good job of evaluating whether or not you've comprehended the textbook. But the workbook, it's not designed to be the study guide. It's not comprehensive in every topic that it touches. And there very well may be test questions that come along related to things that were not quizzed to you in that workbook. And so the biggest mistake, Sarah, that I see people make is they get this big textbook that they're intimidated to read, and they get this workbook that comes along with with it that doesn't have as much on each page. It's multiple choice. It seems a lot more inviting. And so they decide that they're going to study the workbook to try to prepare for the exam rather than reading the text. And as we said with the online bit, maybe for a different reason, that's a recipe for disaster, because what's going to happen is you're going to have a Swiss cheese technician, somebody who has some knowledge, but there's holes all over the place. And that's going to create a problem for taking the exam, but it's definitely also going to create problems for them down the road when those knowledge gaps show up in the department.
And you can almost see that right away when you start using the workbook. And that's probably why when I relied heavily on the workbook, because the textbook was so intimidating for my test, was that I didn't understand even the questions they were asking me, because let's just say it had a bunch of abbreviations in it and I didn't know what those abbreviations meant. So I was just guessing. And then I'd feverishly look to the back to see if I got it right because I needed that validation. Yeah. And of course I didn't, because I didn't have that baseline comprehension between regulatory bodies. So of course I couldn't figure out what abbreviation was correct, because I didn't even know what it meant to be a regulatory body in like a type of example. Yeah. So as someone that has experienced the Swiss cheese effect, I like that. That sounds like Inception. We call it the Swiss cheese effect. I like that. But as someone who's experienced that, yes, 100%, Bobby. That is such a valid and lived experience in a lot of our studying.
Yeah. And so as you're going through that workbook and experiencing that unsurety, rather than guessing and then celebrating that you got the right guess, use that as an alarm bell that I need to study this information more. So as a leader, I did the same thing with technicians when we would go through that 90-day competency. When we're releasing them from training, we would sit down with everything that they needed to know coming out of training, and I would quiz them on it. And I would always let them know at the beginning of that if there's something in here that you don't know, I want you to be affirmed in that that's revealing to us a problem in our training process and not necessarily a problem with you as an individual, right? And we're just looking for where those gaps are and where the additional training needs to happen so that when we finally get that competency all the way filled out, we're confident that they have the material that they need to have. I see the workbook as a lot of the same way. You study the textbook, but then those comprehension quizzes do a good job of poking various bits of the material and making sure that you can comprehend that and get your quiz right. And if you're missing stuff, the answer isn't go memorize the answers in the back of the workbook. It's go back to your textbook and read that section again, because there may be some more information beyond what they poked at that you missed.
Exactly. And, it speaks a lot to last week's episode where we talked about different tools we could use, like active guessing. Sometimes it's wondering what isn't the answer and asking ourselves that over and over again to highlight what we may not know and why we can't figure it out. So I love it. It's like, Bobby, it's like you were here with us last week too. I love hanging out. This is going to be great. Let me take a little break from a word from our sponsor. It's time for our mid-episode confidence boost, where we focus on a key sterile processing test concept. Now, there's no guarantee that these concepts will be on the test that you take, but they are key concepts to the workplace and they are discussed in the literature. Today, we'll be covering PPE donning. Now, PPE, or personal protective equipment, are the resources and the equipment used in decontamination to protect you. So the sequence in which I'm going to go over with you today is imperative that you follow them to make sure that you're the safest you can be in decontamination. Now, donning simply means to put on. There is an appropriate sequence used to assure the equipment's being put on the right way. It's important that you comply to this because it could be a part of your hospital's policy. So if you have questions, make sure you're seeking clarity on how to put on your PPE appropriately. Now, the CDC recommends that when you're applying PPE, you put it on in this order. First, the shoe covers, and then wash your hands. Next, the gown. Should be opened in the back, secured at the neck and the waist. You want to make sure you have the right level resistant gown. Then the mask. Properly adjust it to fit. Some have ties and others have elastics. Masks with ties. place over your mouth, nose, and chin. Now, when you're wearing a face mask, I know it can be a lot because it's like hard to breathe and it could be hot in decon, but you could be aerosolizing when you're spraying the water. Definitely droplet transmission going on. So you want to make sure you have some type of protection over your nose and your mouth, okay? Tie the upper set of ties at the back of your head and then the lower set at the base of your neck if your mask has ties. Then you're going to put on the goggles or face shield. Position over your face and or your eyes to secure it to your head, and use the attached earpieces or a headband if it comes with one. Note, your safety glasses are not a substitute for goggles or face shields. Gloves are donned last. Make sure you check with your facility to see if they use 2 pairs of gloves. But regardless, when you're putting your gloves on, insert each hand into the appropriate glove and adjust it as you need it for comfort and dexterity. If you're wearing an isolation gown, tuck the gown cuffs securely under each glove to provide a continuous barrier protection for your skin. That's going to wrap this week's mid-episode confidence boost. Good luck. Hey everybody, and welcome back. If you are just joining us, I'm actually going to encourage you to start the episode over. Why are you listening to a podcast halfway through, first of all? And if you stopped this and it's been more than 4 hours, I know you don't remember the first whole part of this podcast, okay? So go ahead, start this episode over, because Bobby and I are actually talking about the power of literature and why the book matters in your test prep and your studying and your certification confidence. Before we went away on break, Bobby was really speaking to the effectiveness of a workbook and how it demonstrates the Swiss cheese effect in if you're only using the workbook, you may not be taking the time to completely comprehend what is being taught. So you may just be pushing yourself into this memorization mode, dare I say. And then we spoke a lot about how it's important to vet online information and why it may be inaccurate. And even with the best intentions, may be setting us up for, failure. Yeah, because if you study the wrong information really hard, you're still studying the wrong information. And that's discouraging, right, Bobby? Has that ever happened to you? You realize you studied the wrong info for like 4 hours?
Absolutely painful. Absolutely painful. I don't think that happened with my certification, but it certainly did in college. I remember studying the wrong study guide for a course for a midterm and the oh no moment whenever you see the exam. So yeah, that's a situation you don't want to put yourself in.
Oh my gosh. And it's one everybody's lived, right? It's like you feel like you studied so hard and then you showed up and you're like, none of this. Like, am I even in the right class? Like, what day is it? What time is it? Where am I? Yeah. So you don't want that to be happening when you sit for your certification test, let alone the certification test that you probably paid out of pocket for. Am I right?
That's right. And so bringing this back to the big question of the podcast, does the book matter, or why does the book matter? Absolutely. Because they did not write this exam to copy and paste over workbook quiz questions or pull suggestions from online flashcards that are out there. You will be asked some very specific material that you were probably not quizzed on. Like, you may not need an everyday practice to know what the atmospheric pressure at sea level is, but there's actually a really important steam sterilization calculation that goes on in determining the pressure inside the chamber that involves knowing that number, that I believe it's 14.7, but don't listen to the guy on the internet. Read your book and verify.
Right.
But you may need to know that. And so going through the book is what ultimately is going to matter, and make sure that you're prepared for that exam.
And, I think you do bring up a good point with just even mentioning the sea level. I can tell you, as someone that is in New England, I literally didn't even spend any time remembering that. I was like, I am never going to, unless like my state gets submerged completely in water, that is never going to be an issue for me. But that's not the experience of someone that lives, in Colorado. in the Rocky Mountain range, right? Or somebody who works in Louisiana and they're below sea level, or, you know, somebody that is working with water quality, you know, issues, whereas in the area that I am, we have really great water, so we don't need to chemically treat and really aggressively treat our water in our facilities the same way somebody might out in the Midwest or out in the desert region. So all of these things come into consideration when you're studying. And that's why when they make the test, it's so inclusive. It's not just based on Sarah's lived reality of great water and not living above, you know, sea level. Yeah. It's not based just on that. It's based on the overall sterile processing practice, not just a niched experience.
Yeah, that's really good. And it's not only about our location, it's also about our different department practices. You could have two departments across the street from one another that do totally different things. One has a linen folding, you know, kind of old school, still doing kind of that central service, maybe tied to materials management. And the other sterile processing might not even have a sterile storage. They may just be receive it through decontam, process it, sterilize it, send it back to the OR core, and they never see it again. So very different experiences. So we need that baseline knowledge across all departments and not just our own experience. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So Sarah, we've talked for a while now about why is the book important, and everybody at this point is, you know, banging their head against the wall like, we get it, the book is important. So what do we do now? Like, any tips or tricks about how to use the book and how not to be so intimidated by it?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I think a good tool for when you're utilizing the book is, of course, go back to the episode where we talked about our study styles. If you own the book, being able to write in the book will help you, or highlighting in the book can help. I remember when we were talking about this episode, Bobby, you and I got really passionate about the word bubbles in the book and how they kind of became that epicenter of focus on what I needed to study on the rest of the page. So I know I appreciate a good word bubble as much as you do, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the night before I took my certification exam, I went back to my textbook and I just sped read through the entire book, looking only at the glossary terms and the word bubbles, because a lot of those word bubbles, they summarize key ideas and concepts. Now, let me make sure that you're not hearing me saying, Bobby said you only have to read the word bubbles to do well in your exam. That's not it. You need to read the book. All of it is useful, but not all of it's important, but maybe not all of it is equally important to your success on the exam. So read all of the material, but pay really careful attention to those kind of highlighted, bolded words, those key word bubbles. And just from my own experience, you know, several versions of the test ago, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, when I took my exam, that practice of the day before, going through and just rereading all of the word bubbles, all of the bolded words, all of the charts, helped me with a number of questions on my exam that I otherwise wouldn't have known the answer to. I remember thanking myself at the end of taking that exam that I did that practice the day before. So I found that to be really useful.
And I like how you alluded to what we're actually going to be talking about on next week's episode. The statement that, is it relevant or is it important? We will be discussing that more in depth next week. So if you're interested in learning different tools to help you disseminate information, all the information in the book, because trust me, there's a lot. And there's a reason why people don't want to look and crack open this big, thick book. But like we said, this episode, you gotta do it. Okay. But next week, we'll talk about how to separate that information from what you need to know, what you don't need to know, and how to figure that out for yourself. But Bobby, we can't let them get off yet. Homework assignment, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about your homework assignment for next week. I need you to take an inventory or make a list of all the different ways you've been preparing for the test. And be honest with yourself. Nobody's going to read the paper that you write down. You hide it. You don't ever have to talk about it again. It's just yours to have, okay? So be honest. Physically, what resources are you using? Mentally, how are you delegating your time? Emotionally, how are you dealing with all of this studying? Are you overwhelmed? Have you checked in with yourself lately? Are you actually having a good time studying? There's some people out there that really like to study, okay? But the big ask for this homework is just take an inventory of how you're going about that, because we'll bring that into next week's episode and talk about how you can monopolize the time you're already spending by deciding what's relevant and important. Bobby, this was awesome. Thank you again for joining us and talking about why the book was important.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this one specifically. I think this is going to be my favorite topic out of all 52. Be about the book, people. Be about the book. Thanks for having me on, Sarah.
And that's going to do it for this week's episode. For more sterile processing education and resources, make sure to visit beyondclean.net or follow Beyond Clean on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget to check out over 1,000 SPD-related videos at youtube.com/beyondclean. If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can reach out to info@beyondclean.net. Finally, make sure to download the Beyond Clean mobile app on the Apple and Android app stores so that you don't miss a future episode of any of the other awesome Beyond Clean podcasts. My name's Sarah B. Cruz, and you've been listening to Confidence Certification. Until next time, keep fighting dirty and pass that test with confidence.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast series are of Sarah B. Cruz only and do not represent the companies she works for or collaborates with.